Let's begin.
Hey there, scary story fanatics. Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. Ever feel that Santa gets a raw deal? I mean, sure, elves make the presents, but he has to visit every child in one night. Well, maybe Santa has some help, and there's someone else visiting children on Christmas Eve as well. Settle in for a holiday treat that I like to call Knecht, Ruprecht.
I have always liked Christmas. What child doesn't like Christmas? I mean, what isn't to like? From the sight of freshly fallen snow and the thoughts of a day off school, to the newest toys displayed and advertised everywhere. Promises that Santa and his reindeer would soon be on their way. It's simply magical. Of course, my younger brother seemed to try his best to spoil the holiday cheer. Looking back, it's not that he was a really annoying or bad kid, nothing like that. He just really looked up to his older brother. And being the angsty preteen that I was, it was more my fault that I found him a nuisance than his own. Well, my disposition towards this behavior changed drastically following my 12th Christmas. And my brother and I have been nearly inseparable since. It started one late afternoon whilst out shopping with our mother. She was great about gathering up presents early and getting her shopping done before most people have the word Christmas on their minds. However, her sons were just as adept at asking for last-minute gifts, spurred on by the marketing tactics of toy conglomerates. In most instances, Mom would have left us home, but Dad had to work late, and we lived out in the country. Combined with the fact that we didn't have a surplus of money coming in, and a babysitter was out of the question. The good thing was that we lived near a pretty quiet, small town, with a very low crime rate, so Mom had no qualms in leaving us in the van while she made her way into the department store. Now, it was mid-afternoon, and for this time of year, that meant that it was already getting dark, the horizon being a golden-orange backdrop beyond a desolate winter landscape, with only a few houses scattered in between. The surprising thing was that the parking lot was nearly empty, a rarity on any day of the holiday season. But it was a small town, and most residents had surely completed their shopping endeavors, or maybe it was just the time of the day. What's important is that my brother and I thought it would be a great idea if we were to get out of the vehicle and play a bit in the falling snow, being mindful not to wander too far from the van. I suppose that the noise had been there from the moment that we had gotten out and shut the door, but my mind was preoccupied with wadding up snow to throw at Taylor, while doing my best to avoid incoming fire myself. It was my brother who first noticed it, turning his head first, and then beginning to walk away. I was wondering where he was going, and promptly told him sternly not to wander off. Taylor didn't listen, and as I hurried to catch back up with him, I turned my attention towards the direction in which his gaze was locked. At first, he looked kind of like a weird homeless guy kicking a bag of trash into a small, nearby river, causing my awareness and anxiety to heighten, but I also noticed that he was ringing a bell, and carrying another burlap sack over his shoulder. He wasn't clad in a red suit, instead, all in black, but he looked just like the iconic storefront-style Santa Claus, aside from some other chromatic discrepancies, such as his jet black, bushy beard. But a few ho-ho-hos, and I was convinced. My pace slowed as I saw my brother reach into his pocket to pull free a few quarters that he had gotten from Dad for being good, to give to the cheerful-sounding stranger. Being only a few feet away, anxiety subsided as Taylor seemed to be in no real harm or danger. I watched him drop a few coins into the black bucket as the man said something to him, too quietly for me to hear. Taylor nodded in agreement and walked away. I too had some change and also felt the need to share in the Christmas spirit of giving. As my brother and I passed, I inquired my brother as to what the man had asked, but the words fell upon my ears from beyond my peripheral, answering for him.
Do you pray?
I don't think I will ever forget the sound of that voice, grating and resonant, and somewhat unworldly. Much closer to him than before, I gained much greater detail of the man in the quickly fading sunlight. Although it was true that his appearance did look much akin to Santa Claus, the figure was seemingly covered in sooty ash from head to foot, leaving the rest of him almost as black as his wardrobe. When I shook my head, no, indicating that I indeed did not pray, I think I saw his eyes glow red, but only just for a moment. I still can't be completely sure of that. At that age, I just assumed that I was being honest, and it wasn't wise for a child to lie around Christmas under the ever-watchful eye of old Saint Nick. I don't know how this creep didn't scare the hell out of my little brother, but I practically threw the change into that bucket from whatever distance away I stood at and walked the other direction. As Taylor and I made it back towards my mother's van, I could have sworn I could hear the sounds of crunching snow underfoot behind us, marching at a slightly quicker pace than ours. But before I could turn behind me and look, I spied my mother making her way towards the van, large bags dangling from both her hands. I did eventually look back, but I saw nothing there. Nothing following behind me or lurking in the shadows. In fact, the man had disappeared entirely, as if never there at all. Soon, I would forget the entire event as if it never occurred. Of course, the night's events would facilitate such an absence of mind. We were all busy packing up our stuff to head out to Grandma's house first thing in the morning for an old-fashioned family Christmas. In a way, there was a lot of dread as we pulled into Grandma Abby's driveway, but not due to the paranormal or any lurking fear, but more the ominous promise of boredom at the hands of mundane ornaments that are never to be touched, topped off with a plentiful helping of the antiquated and that which has been rendered irrelevant if it were not for pointless sentiment. But I convinced my parents to allow me to bring the old 13-inch television from Dad's garage. That accompanied by my game console, and I would at least be able to entertain myself. Of course, the television was buried beneath suitcases, Mom's must-haves, presents triple-wrapped in blankets, and more. So even though I was able to get my hands on my game system almost immediately after stepping out of the vehicle, there would be no gameplay until well into the evening hours. Grandma herself had only one television, which was conveniently placed in the living room. The device, and even the room itself, was seldom used by my grandmother, and I'm pretty sure she would have been cool with me hooking up the system into the 27-inch set. But Mom insisted that Grandma Abby would not enjoy being forced to watch a video game if she did indeed decide to watch a program. By my mother's side, I made my way to the front door with my brother, my father still unloading the vehicle of the most necessary items, and watched my mother ring the doorbell. Grandma Abby must have seen us pull in, because the door opened nearly as soon as my mom had rung the bell. An old woman with white hair and a frail frame wrapped her arms around my mother before turning her attention to us. Taylor smiled and said his hellos first before I was both inclined and obligated to do as well. I always loved Grandma Abby, and even then I think I felt kind of guilty for not wanting to come and see her, because she was always really nice. She would feed my brother and I cookies until we couldn't eat any more. It was really boring at Grandma Abby's house. She lived in basically the middle of nowhere in a one-story home. Sure, she had a television, but she had no cable, and the reception was always terrible to say the least. At least this time, I came armed, and suffering up to and through dinner, I was finally able to get my hands on the 13-inch television and able to plug it in within the spare bedroom. Mom and Dad always took the pull-out bed in the living room. From that point, until sleep finally overtook us, my brother and I played round after round of a first-person shooter in deathmatch after deathmatch, passing the night's time with ease. The following morning, both Taylor and I awoke with an enhanced degree of enthusiasm, feeling all of the magic of Christmas in the air on such a snowy Christmas Eve morning. Now, most kids don't like putting up decorations and hanging lights for Christmas, but I did, especially when it was with my dad. He always had the best ideas and approaches regarding the perfect layouts for creating a picturesque Christmas landscape, and I couldn't help but feel a bit accomplished in being a part of that experience. Plus, anything Dad did, I always wanted to do. So I forewent some gameplay, even at the insistence of my little brother, to go help my dad. Alright, so maybe I didn't really enjoy putting up lights more than winning races against my brother, but have you ever played video games with a 6-year-old? It becomes an exercise in patience rather than a fun experience. Had I known what lay ahead in our itinerary, I likely would have opted for some more gaming with my brother, while I still could. Upon completion of a long day's work, stringing once tangled wads of twinkle lights, my mother and Grandma Abby had informed Dad and I of the night's events. We were going to go to Saturday night Christmas Eve Mass at church. Ugh! I sighed loudly. Immediately, my disgust had caught the attention of my mother, who began scolding me about how church was good for me, and that I need morals in my life, and blah, blah, blah. I kept my mouth shut and did my best not to roll my eyes, hoping the lecture would end soon. Finally, it did, and Mom left the kitchen, leaving me alone with Grandma Abby as I filled a cup of water.
You know, you should not scoff at the house of God around the holidays,
Grandma Abby said from the kitchen table. I, of course, turned my head to face her, confused by the statement at first. I said nothing.
Come, sit, child. I will make your hot cocoa and tell you a story.
She once again spoke softly and sweetly. Itching to get some game time in before I was forced to church on Christmas Eve, sitting at the table and being forced to listen to an old person's story was not something I looked forward to. But I was in her house, and my parents raised me to always give respect to my elders, so I did as she asked of me, and sat at the seat next to hers, awaiting my hot drink.
You know, It isn't wise to abandon the Holy Spirit around the holidays,
Grandma Abby said, placing the steaming cup of goodness before me, the smell of liquefied chocolate wafting into my nostrils. I smiled when I looked down and saw the surface nearly covered in marshmallows. Grandma always added extra marshmallows. Joyful at the sight of this comforting hot drink, I lifted it to my lips, saying thank you to Grandma Abby, and prepared myself for one of her interesting, if not meaningless, stories. This one, however, was far from meaningless.
You see,
She began.
Christmas is a time to honor and cherish life, love, and giving. Even if you don't want to go to church, honey. You should want to make your parents happy. They do a lot for you.
She had a sweet and gentle way of speaking that made it seem less like lecturing and more like a pleasant conversation. In fact, this is where she handed me 3 cookies for dunking into my hot cocoa.
Besides, young one, those who refuse congress with God are fated to be visited by Knecht Ruprecht.
Now, that might sound made up to most people, but Grandma actually had come from Germany as a child, and had a mental library of stories to tell and yarns to spin. I was intrigued and dunked a cookie into my cup before taking another sip. "What's Knecht Ruprecht, Grandma?" I asked with a mouthful of sweets, the heat of the house now finally melting away the cold from the outside.
Knecht Ruprecht is the dark Santa Claus. Everyone knows that Santa brings good little boys and girls toys, and that bad little ones receive lumps of black coal. But it is not Santa who brings the coal, child. Knecht Ruprecht is a dark spirit who hates Christmas, dressed all in black and covered from head to toe in soot from the mines in which he gathers his coal. Over his shoulder, Knecht Ruprecht carries a large sack full of soot, ash, and coal. If you ever see him, he may ask you whether or not you mind your parents, or if you attend church. Little boys and girls who tell him no will be visited on Christmas Eve by the shadow Santa Claus. He will not come through the chimney, but through the bedroom window, in which you sleep peacefully, leaving you horribly disfigured or worse. But the most horrendous fate of all awaits those whom he whisks away, never to be seen again.
During her description, I nearly spat out the hot chocolate in my mouth, being too similar for comfort to the man I saw in the parking lot the other day. I just had to ask, what does he do with the kids that he takes away? Grandma took a sip of her tea and answered the best she could.
No one really knows for sure. Some say he tosses naughty children into an icy river, leaving them to drown in its unforgiving depths. But the most popular belief is that they become his slaves, his workers, if you will, toiling away an eternity in a frigid crevasse of ice and earth far north of the Arctic Circle, forever mining his atrocious coal. And so, again, I reiterate, you should simply appease your parents and agreeably do as they ask. You never know when Knecht Ruprecht will be watching.
Grandma always did try to scare, usually failing, but this time she'd succeeded, because I knew that I didn't have to worry about Knecht Ruprecht watching me. I knew that he and it and I had already come face to face. I finished my hot cocoa and promptly readied myself for an evening church service. I really can't lend too many details of that night because honestly, despite my grandmother's warnings, I was bored to tears and spent most of my time daydreaming, or evening dreaming as it were. I will say that with every single candle lit in the church, it was pretty dazzling. But once the priest began his sermon, I had to fight off sleep induced by boredom. Grandmother's story was a little unsettling at the time of hearing it, and instilled a sense of hesitation when deviating from morality, but only for a short while. That creepy Santa in black was a little disturbing, and Grandma Abby's story a little more than coincidental. But at 12 years old, was I really to believe, to the point of dictating action, that I would be swept away by a malevolent spirit for the purposes of eternal servitude because I chose not to pray? Maybe a story like that would have convinced my little brother, but not me. I had a keen mind, or so I considered, and I didn't much believe in superstitious nonsense. When I bowed my head and closed my eyes for silent prayer, my thoughts were of video games and other cool toys to hopefully come. Prayers remained distant from my mental construct. Upon getting back to Grandma's house, the evening progressed as typical. Mom and Dad sipped alcoholic eggnog, but not to excess. Grandmother rocked in her chair, knitting something that looked like the beginnings of an Afghan, and my brother pestered me to watch Christmas specials with him, something I pretty much gave up on about at the age of 10, except for Rudolph, of course. That one's my favorite. But while my little brother pleaded with me to come and watch Frosty and the Grinch in the living room with Mom, I stood firm on getting in some gameplay. Mom had told me that there was no food or drinks allowed in our room, including Christmas cookies, milk, soda. It was all off limits. I snuck it in anyway, making sure not to leave a mess. If I had left the room for too long, Taylor would notice and try to annoyingly pressure me some more. I'm not sure when Taylor finally fell asleep, because he was already unconscious when Dad carried him in, never once stirring. Dad then asked me to get to bed soon myself, as it was getting late and nearly time for Santa's arrival. I didn't believe much in Santa Claus anymore, but not playing along would have likely resulted in the end of Santa presents, or so I was warned by my parents. I made sure to finish up the cup that I was racing and then promptly switched off the system. Not much time afterward, I was fast asleep in the other bed, about 6 feet distance from my brother. When I first opened my eyes, I noticed that the room was pitch dark, signaling to me that Christmas morning had not yet arrived. As I nestled myself back into the pillow and closed my eyes, I realized what it was that had roused me from slumber. It sounded as though something metallic or rigid was tapping against the window glass, set into the wall in between my brother and I. Before I moved my focus to the glass, I first spied over to my brother's bed to see if he had heard the noise too. His nearly motionless body and mild snoring told me that he had not. When I refocused my attention on the window pane, I nearly shrieked in horror. In fact, I'm still not sure as to why I hadn't, but honestly, the best explanation that I could provide is I was literally paralyzed with fear. Glowing red eyes staring back at me, a wicked smile adorned with rotten black and yellowish brown teeth, targeted at me with more malevolent intent than what can be described in words. And the long fingernails that tapped on the glass, trying to gently get my attention, were unwavered by my observable trepidation. As the glass shattered, I finally let out a powerful yelp, instantly awakening my brother. The thing crawled in as if it were a liquid sliding out of glass, spilling onto the floor right between Taylor and I. The two of us let out one shout for help after another, hoping either someone would come to our rescue or the thing would just leave us alone. Looking back, I remember literally pinching myself, hoping this was all just a terrible nightmare, because that's how surreal it all seemed. But I did not awake, nor did the creature flee. In fact, our shouts and cries seemed to do nothing. It just stood there for a good moment, head tilted towards the floor, covered in a thick black cowl, unmoving, unflinching. Slowly, the thing turned its head in a painfully suspenseful and fluid movement, finally revealing its face to me, illuminated by the winter moonlight cascading through the now broken aperture. That bulbous nose, that grimy, sooty complexion, and the reveal of the entirety of his outfit. There's no mistaking it anymore. No more rationalization left in me. For what stood smiling at me, ignoring the screams of my brother and the now increasing commotion coming from down the hall, was the man from the other day, in the parking lot, shaking his bell. Now, the recollection of that small bag that had kicked into the river and its terrible implications dawned on me. I may have told him that I did not pray. I may not have prayed while attending church, but I was praying then, in that moment, hoping upon hope that someone would come to my aid, for I knew what was to happen next, accentuated by Knecht Ruprecht's action of taking the limp burlap sack off of his shoulder and opening it wide with his two clawed hands. I was quickly wrapped up inside, and I could see nothing but pitch black. In that moment, I knew that I was going to die some horrible death. I wished I had a chance to tell my parents goodbye, to hug my little brother one last time, but it was too late. Suddenly, I was dropped to the floor just before hearing a loud symphony of screaming and unreal growling, both gnashing and tearing of flesh, the sounds of something wet being squashed, coinciding with the echoes of bones breaking. It was the sound of violence, and no matter how hard I struggled to get free, all I could do was wonder who it was that was being torn to pieces. Soon after, the sounds stopped, and only the cries of Taylor could be heard. I was relieved to know my little brother was still alive, but left wondering who it was that had just been eliminated in a most dastardly way. I was once again lifted off the ground, which I laid on and assumedly carried, the sounds of my brother's cries becoming increasingly distant. After that, I'm not sure what happened. The last thing I heard before passing out was the far-off sound of bells. Sleigh bells. When I woke up, I was actually in a hospital, having no recollection of how I had gotten there. My brother and my parents were in the room with me, along with 2 uniformed officers, a doctor and a nurse. Mom and Dad looked so happy to see me, but almost also looked as if they had to ask permission to approach me. Permission from the officers. They hugged me, expressed how much they loved me and how happy they were that I was awake, but had to leave shortly thereafter, escorted out by the men in uniform. My little brother remained, and seemed to be accompanied by the nurse, rather than my parents. Taylor, too, looked really happy to see me. Said that he was happy that I was still alive, and that he and I were going to stay together. I had no idea what he meant, and the medical professionals in the room kept asking him to please change the subject and let me rest, that I needed rest to heal. No one would tell me anything more than that I needed to rest, and that my parents would be back to see me again soon. It was like this for a few days, until I finally learned the truth. For a while, my brother and I lived in foster care together, but we're back with our parents shortly thereafter, upon being acquitted of the charges against them. Grandma Abby was torn to pieces that night, nearly limb from limb. Taylor said that he covered his eyes, and he's probably telling the truth, or I'm sure that he would have needed more therapy than he had received, he and I both. But of course the police weren't going to believe him, and the detectives found no evidence to corroborate my parents' story. The only odd thing is that each of our stories, even my statement after being unconscious for 3 days, having no way to form a plot with my kin, was identical. But again, who's going to take a Dark Santa from Germany myth as a criminal perpetrator seriously, as a legitimate claim? But eventually, Mom and Dad were released, and we were a family again. The biggest surprise, to me anyway, is what Taylor had told me about how they had found me. The one thing they kept from police. Taylor told me that they had found me in the snow, not far from the house, tied up in a burlap sack, a giant red bow on top, and hoof prints embedded in the fallen white powder nearby. Taylor swore to me, and does to this day, that it was Santa Claus that saved me, somehow, because he had asked for it. That he claimed it was his one Christmas wish, to spend more time with his big brother. And even now, grown with kids of my own, I still keep in frequent touch with Taylor, always cherishing any time we get to spend with one another. In fact, every Christmas, we bring our spouses and children and attend Christmas Mass together, as a way of remembering our brave grandmother who gave her life to protect me that night. And every single year, when I bow my head in silence, I make sure that I pray. I pray to God that he never comes back.
Well, seems no matter where you live, what you do, or how far you run, someone will always be watching you, which has to be one of the most intense intrusions of privacy that I've ever heard. But if you want more of that white stuff soaked in red, slide down the slope this way next weekend. And until then, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you all again next Saturday.
Social media can be very unpredictable, especially regarding horror content. If this content gets removed, all new content will be simultaneously presented on various websites provided in the description to this video. Make sure to follow me in other digital spaces so that you never miss out on the terror. Also, if you like this video, make sure to leave a comment and hit the like button. It helps the channel a lot. If you're new to the channel and you enjoy what's here, consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you never miss an upload. Writing is a dream of mine, and it's all of you that make that dream come true.